So in the late 1990s, Boeing and Airbus were both staring at the same data. Air traffic was exploding, airports were running out of room, and everyone agreed something had to change. And both companies came to completely opposite conclusions. Airbus said the future is bigger planes. Boeing said no, smaller planes. And both of them were so confident they were right that they bet tens of billions of dollars on it. One of them was wrong, and it wasn't close. In 1995, Boeing launched a plane called the 777. 2 engines, wide body, could fly just about anywhere. And it completely destroyed the best long-haul plane Airbus had at the time, the A340. The A340 had 4 engines, the 777 had 2. They carried roughly the same passengers, roughly the same distance, but the 777 burned less fuel doing it. Over the A340's entire production run, Airbus sold 377 of them. Boeing has sold over 2,200 777s. That's a 6-to-1 blowout. But what makes this interesting is that 20 years earlier, Boeing couldn't have even built the 777. Not because they didn't have the technology, because it was literally against the rules. For decades, there was something called the 60-minute rule. Twin-engine planes couldn't fly more than 60 minutes from the nearest airport. The logic was pretty straightforward. If one engine fails over the ocean, you need to be close enough to land somewhere before the other one goes too. So if you wanted to cross the Atlantic or Pacific, you needed 3 or 4 engines. That's why the 747 existed. That's why the DC-10 existed. That's why Airbus built the A340 with 4 engines. It wasn't really a design choice. It was a legal requirement. But engines kept getting more reliable. And in 1985, the FAA changed the rules. They let TWA fly a twin-engine 767 from Boston to Paris, first long-haul over-water flight ever approved for a 2-engine plane. The 767 burned 7,000 pounds less fuel per hour than the 3-engine plane it replaced on the same route. Airlines noticed immediately. By 1991, more passengers were crossing the Atlantic on twin-engine 767s than on every 3- and 4-engine aircraft combined. And the rules kept expanding. 120 minutes from an airport, then 180, then 330. By the mid-2000s, a twin-engine plane could legally fly anywhere on Earth that a 4-engine plane could. The whole reason 4 engines existed in the first place had just evaporated. And there's an irony here that's worth sitting with. Airbus developed the A340 alongside a twin-engine plane called the A330. Same airframe, same fuselage, built together to save money. The A330 got 2 engines. The A340 got 4. Today, the A330 is still flying, still getting orders. The A340 has been out of production since 2011. Same airplane, different number of engines, completely different outcome. So Airbus watched the A340 get destroyed by a twin-engine competitor. And then they decided to build an even bigger 4-engine plane, which sounds insane, but they actually had their reasons. Because before Airbus spent $25 billion on the A380, Boeing tried to do the exact same thing. In 1996, Boeing unveiled designs for the 747X, a stretched double-decker 747 that could carry over 650 passengers. The biggest version would have had the famous 747 hump running all the way to the tail. Boeing took it to Airlines. Airlines said, "Interesting, tell us more." So Boeing kept adding features, kept customizing, and costs kept going up. A Boeing executive later put it pretty simply. The market was going down, but costs were going up, and the problem was getting anyone to actually commit. That's the key word, commit. Airlines liked the concept, they just wouldn't sign anything. Boeing killed the project in early 2001. The market forecast said maybe 70 to 80 aircraft over 9 years, development costs north of $5 billion. The math didn't work. So Boeing tried to build a super jumbo. Airlines said no. Boeing dropped it. And then Airbus watched all of that happen and went ahead anyway. In December 2000, Airbus launched the A380. Budget, 9.5 billion euros. 50 firm orders from 6 airlines. And Airbus didn't just build a different plane than the 747X. They sold it differently. Boeing had pitched the 747X as a derivative, a stretch of something that already existed. Airlines could compare it to what they had and decide it wasn't worth upgrading. Airbus positioned the A380 as something entirely new. Double-decked the full length, bars, lounges, showers. They used the same playbook Boeing had used with Pan Am in the original 747 back in the 60s. Sell to the prestige airlines first, and everyone else follows out of competitive pressure. Emirates signed on, then Singapore Airlines, then Qantas. When carriers like that are buying, you feel like you're falling behind if you don't. And the economics pitch was real. 15 to 20% lower cost per seat than the 747. One A380 replacing two 747s on the same route using one airport slot instead of two. At congested airports like Heathrow or Narita, that's a hard argument to turn down. Meanwhile, Boeing was doing something kind of remarkable. They were failing their way into the right answer. On March 29, 2001, the same day Boeing confirmed they were killing the 747X, they unveiled something called the Sonic Cruiser. It looked like something from a science fiction movie. Delta wings, canard design, cruising just under the speed of sound. About 225 passengers. The opposite of the A380 in every way. Airbus was betting on size. Boeing was betting on speed. Some airlines were into it. Richard Branson at Virgin said he expected to order 3 to 6. American Airlines showed interest. Boeing laid out a 5-year plan. Then, September 11th happened. Air travel collapsed. Airlines lost $13 billion that year and another $11 billion the next. 1,000 planes were parked. And suddenly, nobody cared about speed. Nobody cared about size. Airlines wanted one thing: efficiency. Every dollar of fuel burn mattered now in a way it hadn't before. Boeing held on to the Sonic Cruiser for over a year, but by December 2002, it was dead. And this is where it gets interesting, because they didn't start over. All the technology they developed for the Sonic Cruiser, carbon fiber composites, new engine architecture, advanced avionics, they took all of it and put it into a completely different kind of airplane. Not fast, efficient. Not big, right-sized. They called it the 7E7, then the 787 Dreamliner. 200 to 300 passengers, 20% less fuel than anything in its class, designed to fly point to point. Connecting cities directly instead of funneling everyone through hubs. Portland to Reykjavik, Austin to Amsterdam, Nashville to London. Routes that could never fill a 500-seat airplane. In 2004, the Japanese airline ANA became the launch customer with 50 aircraft on order. The plane that would eventually kill the A380 was now in production. And while Boeing was building the future, Airbus was running into a problem that would cost them years and billions. Each A380 contains 530 kilometers of wiring. That's over 300 miles of cables running through a single airplane. The wings were built in the UK, fuselage sections in Germany and France, tail in Spain. Everything shipped to Toulouse for final assembly. And when the German wiring harnesses arrived and workers tried to connect them to the French sections, they didn't fit. Different teams had been working with different versions of the design software. Thousands of cables that were supposed to plug together simply didn't match. The fallout was severe. 2 full years of delays. The development cost, originally 9.5 billion euros, started climbing toward 20 billion. Airbus's parent company stock dropped 26%. 5 billion euros of value gone in a day. On October 15, 2007, 19 months behind schedule, Airbus finally delivered the first A380 to Singapore Airlines. And it actually worked well. Singapore said the A380 burned 20% less fuel per seat than their 747 fleet. Emirates loved it. Passengers loved it. The double-deck cabin, the bars, the showers. As a plane, the A380 was genuinely impressive. The business case, though, was another story. Lufthansa put their A380 on Frankfurt to New York, and the per-seat cost dropped, just like Airbus promised. But so did the revenue per seat. Because when you dump 500 seats onto a single route, you have to cut ticket prices to fill them. The cost per passenger went down, the revenue per passenger went down almost as much. Lufthansa was basically breaking even with twice the complexity. And airlines that only bought a handful of A380s had it even worse. Emirates CEO Tim Clark was pretty direct about it. He said the A380 was a misfit for Air France. They only had 10. Running a subfleet of 10 of the biggest plane ever built is a nightmare, and the costs go through the roof. But with 100 of them, it's a completely different operation. The problem was only Emirates had 100. Everyone else bought 10 or fewer, and most of them were losing money on them. But the biggest blow didn't come from airlines struggling to fill seats. It came from the engine manufacturers. When Airbus was gearing up to launch the A380 around 2000, they asked GE and Rolls-Royce a pretty straightforward question: is anything better coming? And both engine makers said no. Nothing on the horizon with better fuel efficiency. Airbus's head of sales, John Leahy, later said the company was blindsided. Their people had assurances from the engine manufacturers that there was nothing coming with better fuel performance for years. And then 3 years later, before a single A380 had been delivered, GE and Rolls announced new engines with 15% better fuel efficiency. And those engines were going on the Boeing 787. So the A380 wasn't even flying yet, and its engines were already a generation behind. Every airline comparing wide-body options could now see a 15% efficiency gap, and they were choosing the 787. Then oil prices made everything worse. Jet fuel went from around $50 a barrel in 2003 to $147 by 2008. Operating 4 engines at those prices was brutal. The A340 became completely uneconomical almost overnight. And the A380, while more efficient per seat than the 747, was still burning massive amounts of total fuel as a 4-engine aircraft. The cancellations started stacking up. FedEx pulled their order for the A380 cargo version. UPS canceled their freighter orders. Airbus had to shelve the entire freight program. Virgin Atlantic had ordered 6. They never took delivery and eventually walked away. And there was one more problem that nobody had really thought through. There was no second-hand market. When an airline retires a 737 or a 777, another airline buys it and keeps flying it. Planes get a second life, a third life. But when Singapore Airlines retired their first A380s after just 10 years, practically brand new by airline standards, nobody wanted them. They were scrapped. Because only about 20 airports in the world can even handle an A380. There's just no one to sell it to. So if the A380 was failing for almost every airline that bought it, there's an obvious question. Why did Emirates keep ordering? Because Emirates is not a normal airline. Most major carriers run a mix of domestic and international routes. They connect smaller cities to bigger ones and bigger ones to each other. Emirates doesn't do any of that. They have one hub, Dubai, and their entire model is built around funneling passengers from everywhere in the world through that one airport and then back out again. Think about where Dubai sits on a map. It's roughly halfway between Europe and East Asia. It's a few hours from Africa. It's connected to the Indian subcontinent. If you're flying from London to Sydney, or from Lagos to Singapore, or from Frankfurt to Bangkok, Dubai is right in the middle. Emirates built their whole business around that geography. And when your model is about moving as many passengers as possible through one hub, a 500-seat airplane makes perfect sense. At peak, Emirates was running 8 A380 flights a day to London Heathrow alone. At a slot-constrained airport like that, getting 500 people on one plane instead of 250 on 2 is a genuine advantage. And Emirates had the scale to make it work. Tim Clark didn't buy 10 A380s. He bought 123. That is nearly half of every A380 ever built, one airline. At that volume, your maintenance costs per aircraft come way down. Your crew training is standardized. Your spare parts supply chain makes sense. All the problems that crushed airlines running a sub-fleet of 10 just don't apply when you have 100. But that's also what made the A380 situation so fragile. One airline was responsible for almost half of all orders. When Emirates sneezed, the entire program caught a cold. And when Emirates finally stopped ordering, there was nobody else to pick up the slack. The A380 didn't have a customer base. It had Emirates. And that turned out to be the same thing as having a single point of failure. And there was another problem that made the A380 almost impossible to grow beyond a handful of airlines and routes. The plane didn't just need airlines to buy it, it needed airports to rebuild for it. The A380 is roughly 30% larger than a 747. That doesn't sound like a lot until you start thinking about what it means on the ground. Runways need to be wider. Taxiways need to be reinforced because of the weight. Gates need double jet bridges, one for the upper deck, one for the lower. Baggage systems need to handle twice the luggage per flight. Even the blast from the engines during taxi was strong enough that some airports had to redesign their taxi routes to keep smaller aircraft from getting hit by wake turbulence. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey spent $175 million modifying their airports just to accommodate the A380. And that was one airport authority in one city. Multiply that across every airport that wanted to handle the plane, and the numbers add up fast. And this created a kind of trap. Airlines didn't want to order the A380 unless they knew airports could handle it. And airports didn't want to spend hundreds of millions on modifications unless airlines were going to bring the plane. Each side was waiting for the other to go first. The 787 had none of this problem. It fits at any gate a 767 can use. No runway modifications, no special jet bridges, no infrastructure investment. An airline could start flying a 787 to a new city tomorrow, and the airport wouldn't have to change a thing. So the A380 didn't just need to win on economics. It needed airlines, airports, and regulators to all coordinate around it simultaneously. The 787 just needed a parking spot. Now you'd think Airbus would have looked at all this and started reconsidering, and eventually they did, but not before one of the more embarrassing episodes in the company's history. When Boeing announced the 787 around 2003, Airbus's official position was that they didn't need to respond. They called the 787 a reaction to the A330 and basically shrugged it off. They were so focused on the A380 that they dismissed the most important new airplane in a generation. Airlines felt differently. They kept pushing Airbus to build something to compete with the 787. And after enough pressure, Airbus put together a proposal. They called it the A330-200 Lite. It was pretty much what it sounds like. The same A330 fuselage with some new wings and engines attached. A quick fix. Airlines weren't having it. Singapore Airlines CEO said that if Airbus was going to go through the trouble of designing a new wing, tail, and cockpit, they should have just designed a new fuselage too. Qantas rejected the proposal outright and ordered 787s instead. That forced Airbus back to the drawing board. In July 2006, they announced the A350XWB, extra wide body, a complete redesign from the ground up. New composite fuselage, wider cabin, essentially an entirely new airplane. Singapore Airlines ordered 20 within 4 days. But the redesign cost Airbus 2 years, and the development budget went from about $5 billion to over $15 billion. And the situation was kind of absurd when you step back and look at it. Airbus was simultaneously telling the world that the A380 was the future of aviation, while being forced by airlines to build a smaller, more efficient, twin-engine plane that was the opposite of everything the A380 stood for. And the numbers today tell you everything. The A350 has received over 1,500 orders. The A380 got 251. The plane Airbus didn't want to build outsold their $25 billion flagship 6-1. But there's a part of this story that usually gets left out. Boeing was right about the future. They read the market correctly. They bet on smaller, efficient, point-to-point twins, and the market proved them right by a factor of nearly 10-1. And they almost destroyed themselves building it. The 787 came in 3 years late. When it finally entered service in 2011, its lithium-ion batteries started catching fire. The entire worldwide fleet was grounded in 2013. Then came years of quality control problems, production slowdowns, delivery halts, a near complete stop from 2021 to 2022. Boeing has spent $32 billion on the 787 program and still hasn't broken even. They need somewhere between 1,300 and 2,000 sales before they see a profit. And that's just the 787. The 737 MAX crashes in 2018 and 2019 nearly ended Boeing as a going concern. Airbus was wrong about the future. They spent $25 billion on a plane the world didn't need in the quantities they expected. The A380 will go down as one of the most expensive misjudgments in modern industrial history. But Airbus survived, because the A350, the plane they were embarrassed into building, the one they said wasn't necessary, turned out to be one of the most successful wide-body aircraft ever made. Airbus's mistake didn't kill them. It just cost them $25 billion in tuition. Boeing read the future right and nearly went bankrupt building it. Airbus read the future wrong and survived because someone else forced them to build the right plane anyway. The A380 didn't die because it was a bad airplane. Passengers loved it. Pilots loved flying it. Emirates will keep theirs going until the mid-2030s. It died because the world changed, and one company saw it coming and the other didn't. Although, there is one more chapter to this story. When Emirates was pushing for the A380neo, what happened behind closed doors between Tim Clark and Airbus almost changed everything. But that's for another video.